In the unforgiving wilderness of the American Southwest, where survival depends on split-second decisions and the mercy of strangers, one act of compassion would change 2 lives forever and awaken forces that had been waiting in the shadows for years. Tom Bradley never expected that covering a half-frozen girl with his coat on that bitter winter night would lead to the most dangerous dawn of his life. What seemed like simple human decency, protecting someone vulnerable from the harsh elements, would unravel secrets buried deep in both their pasts, secrets that connected them to a conflict much larger than either could have imagined. The girl's chattering teeth and desperate eyes told only part of her story. Sometimes protecting someone means facing the very forces you've been running from your entire life. Behind her fear lay a truth that would explain why, as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky orange and pink, Tom would find himself staring at a sight that made his blood run cold. 500 Apache warriors positioned in perfect formation around his modest ranch, their painted faces reflecting both ancient honor and burning determination. What connection did this freezing girl have to their mission? And why was Tom Bradley the key to everything? This isn't just a story about a cowboy and a mysterious girl. It's about the weight of choices made long ago, the price of redemption, and how a single moment of kindness can either save you or seal your fate. What drove those warriors to surround one man's ranch? If you're ready to discover the truth behind this incredible encounter, hit that like button, subscribe for more amazing stories, and let's dive into Chapter 1. The wind cut through the Arizona territory like a blade, carrying with it the promise of the harshest winter in decades. Tom Bradley pulled his worn leather coat tighter as he guided his horse through the narrow canyon path, the animal's breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. 23 years of living in this unforgiving land had taught him to read the signs, and tonight everything screamed danger. He'd been returning from Tucson after selling his cattle, his saddlebags heavy with the coins that would keep his small ranch running through the winter months. But as his horse drew closer, Tom's heart lurched. The girl's eyes fluttered open as he approached, dark, intelligent eyes filled with a terror so profound it made his chest tighten. She tried to speak, but only a weak whisper escaped her trembling lips. It was a young woman, maybe 17 or 18, her long black hair matted with frost, her lips blue from the cold. "They're coming for me, and when they find me, they'll find you." The cold immediately bit into his arms through his thin shirt, but he ignored it. "You're safe now." 20 years. It had been 20 years since he'd heard those words, since he'd fled everything he'd ever known he asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer, and started over with nothing but a new name and the determination to forget his past. The Apache raids, the broken treaties, the night everything went wrong and blood stained the desert sand. But looking into this girl's desperate eyes, Tom Bradley realized that some sins never truly disappear. They just wait in the shadows until the right moment to reclaim you. She wore only a thin cotton dress, torn and stained, completely inadequate against the brutal temperature that had already claimed the lives of seasoned travelers. His medallion, the one he'd lost the night he became a different person. Somewhere out there, forces were already in motion, forces that had been waiting 20 long years for this moment. And as the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, Tom Bradley knew that his new life was about to end, and Lieutenant Thomas Brennan's sins were finally coming home. The money represented 6 months of backbreaking work, every penny earned through sweat and determination. "My name is Maria Santos. My father was Captain Eduardo Santos of the Territorial Cavalry. He told me about Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, about what really happened at Apache Springs, about why the peace treaty was never signed." Her eyes closed as exhaustion overwhelmed her. "He said if anything ever happened to him, I should find you. He said you were the only one who could make things right. And you You're not really Tom Bradley, are you?" But as his horse's hooves echoed against the canyon walls, Tom's mind was intent on profit. It was on the strange feeling that had been gnawing at him all day, the sensation of being watched. That's when he saw her. Huddled against a boulder, barely visible in the moonlight, was a figure so still he almost mistook it for a pile of discarded cloth. Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, the man he'd tried so hard to forget, the soldier whose single moment of conscience had cost him everything and everyone he'd ever cared about. He'd buried that name along with his uniform, changed his identity, and fled west to build a new life where no one knew his shame. Tom dismounted immediately, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. In that instant, Tom saw something that made his blood freeze, not just fear, but recognition. This girl knew him. Somehow, impossibly, she knew exactly who he was. "Easy there," Tom said softly, removing his heavy coat without hesitation. As he wrapped the coat around her shivering frame, their eyes met for a brief moment. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Tom's hands stilled as he adjusted the coat around her shoulders. "Who are you?" She looked up at him, with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. The words hit him like a physical blow. Captain Santos. The name brought back memories Tom had buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself they belonged to someone else. "I don't know what you're talking about," Tom lied, but his voice lacked conviction. Maria's hand emerged from beneath the coat, clutching something that made Tom's world tilt on its axis. A silver medallion, tarnished with age, bearing the insignia of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. "My father kept this," Maria whispered, her strength failing. Tom felt the weight of 20 years crashing down on him. "But shame," Tom realized as he lifted the unconscious girl into his arms, "has a way of finding you no matter how far you run." As he settled Maria onto his horse and climbed up behind her, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching from the darkness beyond the canyon walls. The ride back to his ranch felt like a journey into his own past, each hoofbeat bringing him closer to a reckoning he'd never stopped dreading. Tom's ranch sat in a small valley surrounded by red rock formations, a modest homestead he'd built with his own hands over the past 15 years. As he carried Maria inside, her unconscious form felt impossibly light in his arms, like she was fading away even as he tried to save her. As color slowly returned to her cheeks and her breathing grew steadier, memories he'd fought to suppress came flooding back with painful clarity. The warmth of his cabin was a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside, and he quickly laid her on the rough-hewn bed near the stone fireplace. It had been a routine patrol mission, or so they'd been told. Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, fresh out of West Point and full of idealistic notions about honor and duty, leading 20 men to establish a temporary camp near the sacred Apache waters. What they didn't know was that Captain Eduardo Santos had already negotiated a secret peace treaty with Chief Mangus, Maria's grandfather. For the next hour, Tom worked frantically to warm her, stoking the fire until it roared, wrapping her in every blanket he owned, preparing hot broth from the rabbit he'd been saving for his own supper. The message you received that night, the one saying the Apache had broken the treaty and were planning an attack, it was forged. When scouts reported Apache warriors moving toward their camp, he'd made the decision that would haunt him forever. "I killed him and all those men because I believed a lie." He'd ordered his men to open fire first, shattering the peace treaty before it could be signed, killing Chief Mangus and 17 other Apache leaders who had come to finalize the agreement. "Colonel Morrison knew you were an honorable man, knew you'd follow orders to protect your men. But certain interests, mining companies hungry for Apache land, politicians who built their careers on conflict, couldn't allow peace to succeed. Those men are still dead. That's why my father sent me to find you. Nige wants to meet with me?" The real enemy was the greed that turned honorable men into weapons. Maria struggled to stand, her determination outweighing her physical weakness. But there's something else you need to know. Colonel Morrison is still alive, still in power. When he learned my father had the evidence, he didn't just kill him. He told the Apache that you were responsible for my father's death too. The man whose uncle I killed, Chief Nietzsche, my grandfather's nephew, has agreed to meet with you. In a few hours he would either find redemption or die for crimes he never intended to commit. The freezing girl he'd covered with his coat wasn't just someone he'd saved. She was his last chance at salvation and possibly his doom. He knows about the deception now, knows you were used as a tool by evil men. He wants to honor my grandfather's original vision. He wants peace, Tom asked, his voice barely a whisper. Your grandfather is still dead. Tom joined Maria at the window and felt his heart stop. Scattered across the surrounding hills, barely visible in the darkness, were the flickering lights of torches, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The war still happened. They needed the war to continue, needed the Apache to remain the enemy. Apache Springs. The name alone made his hands shake as he ladled broth into a wooden bowl. By now, every Apache warrior within 100 miles believes you are the man who destroyed their peace and killed their ally. Maria moved to the window, her face pale in the moonlight. They're not coming here to talk, Thomas. They're coming for revenge. Yes, and my people have carried that betrayal for 20 years. But my father discovered the truth, Lieutenant Brennan. He found Colonel Morrison's real orders, the forged documents, the payments from the mining companies. He was going to expose everything, clear your name, and finally bring peace. Until sunrise, Chief Nietzsche is an honorable man. He won't attack in darkness without giving you a chance to speak. But when that sun comes up, if you can't convince 500 warriors that you're not their enemy... She didn't need to finish the sentence. 20 years of guilt, 20 years of believing he was a murderer, and here was evidence that he'd been as much a victim as anyone else. But the revelation brought no relief, only a deeper, more complex pain. She was stronger than she'd appeared in the canyon, her spirit unbroken, despite whatever ordeal had left her half-frozen and alone. The treaty would have ended 3 years of bloodshed, established clear boundaries, and allowed both peoples to coexist. They killed him 3 days ago, shot him down in the street like a dog when he tried to deliver the evidence to the territorial governor. But before he died, he gave me this. She reached into her dress and pulled out a leather pouch, her hands shaking. The real orders, the proof that you were manipulated into starting a war. Maria stirred as Tom held the spoon to her lips, her dark eyes opening with a clarity that startled him. You remember now, she said softly, not a question but a statement. You remember what they made you do? Tom's hand trembled as he set down the bowl. I remember what I chose to do. No one made me pull that trigger. You were lied to, Maria insisted, struggling to sit up. My father spent years investigating what really happened. The words cut deeper than any blade. Tom remembered that night with crystalline precision. The urgent message, the fear in his soldiers' eyes, the weight of command on his shoulders. I killed your grandfather, Tom whispered, the confession tearing from his throat like broken glass. Maria's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. Was going to. Maria's composure finally cracked, grief overwhelming her carefully maintained strength. Tom stared at the pouch as if it contained a rattlesnake. It doesn't matter, he said quietly. But now we can end it, Maria said urgently. Tom felt the room spinning around him. He understands that the real enemy was never you, Lieutenant. The blood drained from Tom's face. What? He sent word to the tribes that Tom Bradley was actually Thomas Brennan in hiding and that you'd murdered Captain Santos to keep your war crimes secret. As if summoned by her words, a sound echoed across the valley. The distant war cry of Apache warriors, carried on the wind like a promise of death. How long do we have?" Maria looked at him with eyes that held both terror and hope. Tom stared out at the lights surrounding his valley and realized that his past had finally caught up with him. The hours until dawn stretched like an eternity, each minute heavy with the weight of impending judgment. Tom moved through his cabin with mechanical precision, checking his rifle, counting ammunition, securing the windows. But his mind was consumed by memories he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Maria watched him from the bed, her dark eyes following his every movement with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. 500 warriors don't surround a man to have a conversation. "You're preparing to fight them," she observed, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Maria struggled to her feet, her legs still unsteady, but her resolve unwavering. "My father believed in you, Lieutenant. Even after learning what happened at Apache Springs, even knowing the pain it caused our people, he believed you were a good man led astray by evil, just like you were before they broke your spirit." She moved closer, and Tom could see the tears glistening in her eyes. "Do you know what Chief Mangas said the night before he died? My father was there as a witness to the treaty signing. He heard my grandfather's final words. I've hated myself for 20 years. I became a different person, built a new life, with the same heart that made you protect a stranger without question. The man who covered me tonight, who brought me to warmth and safety. That's who you really are, Lieutenant. That's who you've always been." But every night I saw his face. Every night I heard the screams of the dying. He's studied with white teachers, speaks perfect English, understands both worlds. But he's also witnessed 20 years of broken promises, 20 years of his people being pushed from their ancestral lands. But he also knows that his warriors need to see that their pain has been acknowledged, that the man they blame for their suffering is willing to face them without hiding behind lies. He wants peace, but he won't accept it without justice. How do I explain that I was following orders that were based on lies? You show them the evidence my father died to preserve, and you ask them for something that might be even harder than forgiveness. How do I make them understand that I've carried their pain, as well as my own all these years? The Apache forces were repositioning, tightening their circle around the valley. Through the window, Tom could see that the torches had multiplied, creating a ring of light that enclosed his small ranch like a noose. You're talking about bringing down powerful men who have spent 20 years covering their tracks. He looked up at Maria through tears he didn't know he was capable of shedding. The warriors surrounding us tonight are his legacy, but so is the dream of a world where Apache and white man can live without fear of each other. The sound sent chills down Tom's spine, but Maria's face grew peaceful. For the first time since that terrible night at Apache Springs, he felt hope. Maria asked, her hand finding his in the darkness. Not hope for escape or survival, but hope for redemption. Hope that the young lieutenant who had tried to do the right thing might finally have a chance to succeed. And in his small cabin, a man who had spent 20 years running from his past, finally prepared to face it head-on. They're honoring the dead, preparing their spirits for what's to come. She looked at Tom with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. But it's also a song of rebirth, Lieutenant. In Apache tradition, every ending is also a beginning. Colonel Morrison and the men who orchestrated the massacre are still alive, still in positions of power. They're still profiting from the conflict they created. My father's murder proves they'll kill anyone who threatens to expose the truth. How do I face his nephew? How do I look Chief Nietzsche in the eye and ask for forgiveness? I'm preparing to survive, Tom replied, loading his Winchester with steady hands despite the turmoil in his heart. They do if that man has something they need to hear. Tom's hands stilled on his rifle. Your father was a fool. My father was a man of honor, Maria shot back, her eyes flashing with anger. Tom felt his chest tighten, but he couldn't stop himself from asking, what did he say? He understood that soldiers follow orders, that sometimes good men do terrible things when they believe they're protecting others. Somewhere out there, 500 Apache warriors waited for sunrise, each one carrying the weight of 20 years of anger and loss. Some had lost fathers at Apache Springs, others had lost sons in the war that followed. All of them believed he was their enemy. His last wish was that someday the truth would come to light and the lieutenant would forgive himself. The war that followed claimed hundreds of lives on both sides. My grandfather knew that violence would only breed more violence. That's why he wanted peace. That's why my father spent his life trying to expose the truth. And that's why I'm here now. He said he forgave the young lieutenant before the shots were even fired. The words hit Tom like a physical blow, and he staggered backward, the rifle slipping from his hands. He forgave me? After I killed him? He understood that you were as much a victim as anyone else, Maria said softly. Tom sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. The same way you looked at a freezing girl in a canyon and chose to give her your coat, Maria said, kneeling beside his chair. Outside, the wind had died down, and in the eerie stillness they could hear the distant sounds of horses and voices. "Tell me about Nietzsche," Tom said quietly. "If I'm going to meet him at dawn, I need to understand who he is." Maria's expression softened with something approaching reverence. "He's not like the other war chiefs, and justice means my death." "Justice means the truth," Maria corrected. "Nietzsche knows that killing you won't bring back the dead or heal the wounds of the past." Tom stood and walked to his window, staring out at the sea of torches that surrounded his home. "What am I supposed to say to them?" Tom asked. "You speak from your heart," Maria said, joining him at the window. "You tell them the truth about that night." Tom turned to look at her, confusion in his eyes. "You ask them to help you find the real enemies," Maria continued. The implications of her words slowly sank in. "You're talking about more than clearing my name. I'm talking about finally giving Chief Mangas the justice he deserved," Maria said firmly. "My grandfather died believing that peace was possible." As if responding to her words, a new sound echoed across the valley. The rhythmic beating of drums, low and mournful, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. "The death song," she whispered. Tom felt something shift inside him as he listened to the drums, something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. The eastern horizon was beginning to show the faintest hint of grey. Dawn was less than an hour away. "Are you ready?" Tom squeezed her fingers, drawing strength from her courage. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm ready to try." Outside, the drums grew louder, and the torches began to move, forming patterns in the darkness as 500 Apache warriors prepared to witness either justice or revenge. The first rays of sunlight painted the Arizona sky in shades of gold and crimson, and as Tom stepped out of his cabin with Maria at his side, the sight that greeted them stopped his breath in his throat. 500 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, arranged in perfect formation around his valley like an ancient amphitheater of judgment. The silence was deafening, broken only by the whisper of wind through the canyon walls and the soft footfalls of his boots on the rocky ground. When he reached the center of the circle, Tom stopped and looked up at Chief Nietzsche, seeing in the Apache leader's eyes not the hatred he expected, but a profound sadness that mirrored his own. Their painted faces caught the morning light, and their eyes followed his every movement with the intensity of eagles watching prey. He said the young lieutenant's eyes held no hatred, only confusion and pain. "These documents prove what many of us suspected but could never prove, that Apache Springs was not the beginning of our war, but the end of our hope for peace, orchestrated by men who grew rich from our suffering." He turned to address his warriors, speaking in rapid Apache, and Tom watched as the mood of the assembled force shifted from anger to understanding, from vengeance to shared purpose. What would you have done in Tom's situation? Would you have had the courage to face 500 warriors, to clear your name and seek justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Smash that like button if this story gave you chills. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing true stories of courage, redemption, and the power of human connection. Your engagement helps us bring you more incredible tales like this one. At the center of the formation, on a magnificent black stallion, sat Chief Naiche, a man whose presence commanded respect even from his enemies, his weathered face bearing the wisdom of years and the weight of his people's suffering. Where Apache warriors and a broken cavalry officer shared their stories of loss, their memories of the dead, and their dreams of a future where their children might know peace. Their unlikely partnership becoming the foundation for a peace treaty that would finally honor Chief Mangus's original vision. Maria Santos became their liaison. Her father's sacrifice transformed from tragedy into triumph as justice was finally served, and the freezing girl who had stumbled into Tom's path that winter night became the bridge between two worlds that had been kept apart by greed and deception. The cowboy, who had covered a shivering stranger with his coat, discovered that sometimes salvation comes not from running away from your past, but from having the courage to face it with the help of those who understand that healing requires truth, justice demands action, and peace is only possible when built on the foundation of shared humanity rather than shared hatred. Chief Naiche offered Tom not forgiveness, for there was nothing to forgive a man who had been as deceived as they were, but partnership in hunting down the real architects of Apache Springs, Colonel Morrison and his conspirators, who continued to hold positions of power and influence. The Apache leader dismounted and examined the evidence with careful attention, his fingers tracing the signatures and seals that proved the deception. And when he finally looked up at Tom, there was recognition in his eyes, not of an enemy, but of a fellow warrior who had been used and discarded by powerful men with no honor. Tom walked forward slowly, his hands empty and visible, Maria's leather pouch containing the evidence clutched against his chest like a shield of truth. "I am Lieutenant Thomas Brennan," Tom said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent valley, "and I have come to face the truth of what happened at Apache Springs 20 years ago." He held up the leather pouch, his hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "But I have not come alone, and I have not come empty-handed. Maria Santos, daughter of Captain Eduardo Santos and granddaughter of Chief Mangus, carries with her the proof that we were all victims of a greater evil, men who profited from our pain and fed on our hatred for each other." As Maria stepped forward and opened the pouch, revealing the forged documents and real orders that had orchestrated the massacre, Tom watched Chief Naiche's expression change from stoic judgment to something approaching wonder. "My grandfather spoke truly in his final moments," Chief Naiche said, his English perfect and his voice carrying the authority of absolute leadership. What followed was not the execution Tom had expected, but something far more powerful, a ceremony of truth-telling that lasted until the sun reached its zenith. Together, Tom Bradley and Chief Naiche would spend the next 3 years gathering evidence, building alliances, and systematically exposing the network of corruption that had turned the American Southwest into a battlefield for profit. Did this incredible story of redemption and justice touch your heart?